Welcome to the Cyber Center for Biblical Studies. Hi, my name is Herb Bateman. This is the third and final video of a conference held in September featuring Dr. Darrell L. Bock, where he discussed an examination of the Gospels. In the first video, he talked about how to read the Gospels. The second video, he talked about the importance of interpreting the Gospels in light of a historical and cultural setting. In this video, he's going to focus attention on how to understand the Gospels, particularly minding the gap between the events of Jesus and the recordings of those events. The title of this video or this session is Minding the Gap from the Event to Gospel Orality, Memory, and Eyewitnesses. But before he enters into that discussion, he brings some conclusion to the resurrection of Jesus. He goes back to his second session, and he talks about the resurrection and the importance of the resurrection for us as believers. So sit back, enjoy his discussion about the importance of resurrection as he moves from resurrection into minding the gap.
The picture that you see in front of you on the screen is a picture of a burial site located in Jerusalem, first century burial site tied to the Herodian family. And the reason I take a picture of it is because it pictures the kind of cave that a social elite like Joseph of Arimathea likely would have had. And it also pictures the stone that you roll in front of the entry that the women who went to the tomb were concerned about being able to roll away. You can see that's a pretty big piece of rock that you'd have to deal with. And, although the NFL is starting this week, they didn't have any, defensive tackles to help them move the stone. So they were a little worried about how they were going to be able to do that. Because I want to talk about the resurrection a little bit as a kind of transition to minding the gap. And I also want to kind of tie it to where we ended the last lecture. Why is the vindication claim of Jesus so important? Well, the resurrection claim is really a claim about vindication, about the claim of who Jesus is, the claim that God has acted on Jesus' behalf. When I teach about this at the seminary, I make a point that to the pastors to be that you're probably going to preach about the resurrection now and again. That Easter tends to come around on a fairly regular basis. And so you're probably going to talk about the empty tomb and the resurrection a lot. And having a variety of angles to talk about that event is probably a good thing because you're going to talk about that passage more than once. And the point that I like to say is that what we tend to do when we preach on Easter is we tend to emphasize, He is risen, we'll be with Him one day, those kinds of themes. I mean, in Dallas, there's a custom that's developed where you have a cross that you put on your yard that says He is risen about Easter time. People who drive by can identify who all the radical Christians are because they actually believe in the resurrection. And so, we tend to emphasize that dimension of it. He's alive, we'll be alive one day, those kinds of things. And in the process, we probably miss one of the most important things about the resurrection, which is that it ultimately is the vindication of Jesus, who He is and what He was about. And so this predictive claim that He made in front of the Jewish leadership is another way of underscoring, if you have any doubt about who I am, and if you're wondering who's got it right, the Jewish leadership or me, God's voting in this election in 3 days. And His vote counts. And so the resurrection claim is really a claim about the fact that God raised Jesus from the dead and in the process showed who He was by taking Him to His right hand. This is why all the ancient major creeds reference the right hand of God, because it's a way of picturing the importance of Jesus. And so what I want to do is I want to talk about why the resurrection accounts are not created accounts. Skeptics will say, well, it was made up, or a variety of explanations for them to try and suggest why they're not true. And to do this, I want to give you a picture. So imagine you're in the public relations meeting that's taking place between the crucifixion and the resurrection. And you don't believe necessarily the resurrection is going to happen. And it's a meeting of the disciples with the public relations marketing department of what is the fledgling about to be church that now may be defunct because they've lost their leader. And the meeting is, how do we keep hope alive? Our Messiah has been crucified. Okay, and so someone steps forward in the meeting and says, I have a brilliant plan. We need to sell this difficult idea that many people don't believe in of a bodily resurrection. Okay, that's part of what we're going to be about here. Okay, and the Greeks don't believe it at all, and only some Jews do. So we'll go for it. And the way we're going to sell this difficult idea is that we're going to create a story in which the first witnesses to this difficult idea are people who culturally don't count as witnesses in our culture. That's the plan. Okay? And everyone in the room, in the marketing, with marketing sensitivities goes, wonderful plan, that's what we'll do. Okay? All right? And so you get the Gospels written of this so-called made-up story. And the made-up story they all begin the same way in the story of the empty tomb. And the first people to attend to the empty tomb are women who don't culturally count as witnesses in the culture. And this is the way you're going to make up the story. No one would have made up the story that way. So the point here is that no one would have created an account with women as the first witnesses. Now I'm going to try and substantiate this as we move along. Here's another element that's surprising. If you're going to make up the story and you're going to do it on Jewish precedent, you wouldn't have made up the story that we have. Because the Jewish idea was, that for those who did believe in a bodily resurrection, that the bodily resurrection was going to come at the end with everybody. Okay, everybody was going to be raised from the dead at the end. The judgment would be performed. The righteous would go to be with God, and the unrighteous would suffer the fate of the unrighteous. And so, it'd be a pretty grim time. By the way, I want to tell you that I know why there's so many Christians in Texas. Okay? There's so many Christians in Texas because every summer we experience Hades, and people go, if that's what it's like, it's going to be forever, I don't want to go there. Okay? So that's part of it. So you've got this Jewish precedent for an immediate bodily resurrection. And so if you had made up the story on the basis of Jewish precedent, what you would have simply done is to declare as a hope, okay, that one day we're all going to be raised from the dead and Jesus is going to run the judgment. Okay, you're going to be raised with everybody else. See, there is a surprise or a mutation in the Jewish doctrine of resurrection that Jesus' life involves, and that is that there's a resurrection in the midst of history and not at the end. Okay, it comes after 3 days. So that's a surprise that you wouldn't design if you were designing it this way. And then the last point, which is going to be the point of the entire lecture that I'm getting ready to give, is the idea that the age of these claims we can actually trace back to the 30s. Okay, and I'm going to do that for you in a second. So that's kind of where we're going. Here's what we're saying is the examination scene with the Jewish leadership led to a charge of being king before Pilate. What the Jewish leadership did was take the religious charge of blasphemy and translate it into a political charge that Pilate would act on. They made it the charge sedition. Jesus claimed to be a king that Rome didn't appoint. Okay? Rome cared about who she appointed as kings and who were self-appointed as kings. Because Rome believed in law and order. You believe our law or we'll put you in order. Okay? So that was the Roman way. And so you're dealing with this religious charge turned into a relevant for Rome political charge, and Rome becomes responsible. What's really interesting about the gospel story is you got Judas turning Jesus over at the start. You've got Pilate responsible for the declaration of the crucifixion at the end. And so the Jewish leadership is protected on both ends of the story. It's an interesting situation. So the claims of divine vindication, which Jesus made, ran into views that saw Jesus as blasphemer by those who didn't accept that Jesus was who he claimed to be. And it was like two ideas running on a train track in opposite directions that met at Jesus' trial in a huge collision. Only there was one vote that was coming. And the one vote that was coming in that dispute was the vote that God would have, and that's Easter and the resurrection. So once again, we're down to the two options that we saw in the Beelzebul controversy when Jesus was casting out exorcisms and doing other things. And the Jewish leadership says, he's doing that by Beelzebul. And Jesus responded, if Satan's working against Satan, how can his kingdom stand? And basically, if you take away the option of Satan, then it's got to be from above. You've got the same options here at the end of the gospel as well playing themselves out. And the Easter is the vote in that discussion. Okay, so that completes part of what I wanted to say. And the point I've been trying to make in this middle lecture is that cultural scripts out of Judaism actually show what got Jesus into trouble. They also show why the claim to be raised is an innovation and a powerful claim to vindication. They also show the importance of understanding the cultural scripts that are embedded in the Scripture so that you can appreciate how Jesus shows who he is more than talking about who he is. So all that is important in terms of what we tried to do in the last hour. But all this also stands on the trustworthiness of what it is that we've received. Okay? So now I need to transition to the minding the gap, and look at that. Herb's already done it. And it's interesting. He went in the order of orality, memory, and eyewitnesses. And that is what we're going to talk about. But the actual order is first you have the eyewitnesses, then they got to remember what they saw, and then they got to pass it on. Okay? So here's how this works. I want to talk about that period between the event and the recording in a gospel. And to illustrate this, I want to talk about London for a second. Okay? Now, I'm in Warsaw, Indiana, so I'm taking a chance. But how many of you in the room have ever been to London, England? Okay, a handful of you. Okay, so there's hope for the illustration. Okay? If you go to London, England, and you get on the subway, okay, they'll have this little expression on all the subways go, mind the gap. Okay? So you get off the subway, there's where the train comes, there's that little space in between, okay, that only people on a very good diet could fit into, by the way. And then there's the sidewalk, okay? And the idea is to mind the gap. So the idea is that you don't catch your foot and hurt yourself as you step off the train, etc. For those who are suffering from bulimia, the hope is you hope you don't descend into Hades. So you got the option there. Okay, so there's this gap. You've got to pay attention to the gap. When you do gospel studies, you've got to pay attention to the gap. The gap is the time between when the event happened, 30, 33 AD, depending on the 3 years of Jesus' ministry and when you think the end of his ministry was, all the way out to when the Gospels begin to be written in the 60s is where most people put the earlier Gospels, as far as the 90s for where most people put John. So you're talking about a gap of 30 plus years. For more skeptical people who will put the synoptics in the 80s out to perhaps as early as the 1st century, the 2nd century, that gap can grow to be as high as 80 years. But there's this gap. Everyone agrees it exists. Okay? There's no one who thinks Jesus died and was raised, and the next day Matthew said, I've got a brilliant idea, I'm writing a gospel. Okay? So that didn't happen. So there's this gap between the time when the event happened and the time it was written down. And so that's what this lecture is all about. So let's get rolling and talk a little bit about orality and some other things. And this is what we are dealing with. We're dealing with the idea of this gap. In the beginning, okay, there were no books. Okay? Generally speaking, the way information was passed on in the ancient world was orally. And so in the beginning, there was memory and the passing on of things by word of mouth. And some people have made a claim about this gap that's important. And that claim is that the tradition moving orally through time was a little bit like what's been called the memory game, the telephone game, or I like the name they give this in Australia and in parts of Oceania in the southern Pacific Rim, and they call it Chinese whispers. Okay. So here's the way the game works. You tell someone a story. Okay, you give them a long story to tell. You tell it to them. They tell it to the next person, the next person, the next person, the next person. And the argument is, by the time the story gets to the end of the line being passed on orally, it is a completely different story than what you started with. So the point here is that orality, if you want to think of it this way, orality leaks. And in a little bit, I'm going to be talking about memory leaking. But orality leaks. What you get at the end is not what you had at the start. You can't trust what you get. Bart Ehrman, who is a well-known writer, skeptical writer about the New Testament, compares the oral tradition floating through till the time when we're writing down the Gospels. He compares it to this telephone game, to this Chinese whispers. That's one claim that I want to deal with. Second claim that I want to deal with is, even if they were eyewitnesses, memory is not really trustworthy. Memory leaks. Okay? This is John Dominic Crossan, among others. John Dominic Crossan was the co-chair of what was called the Jesus Seminar in the 90s. And done a lot of writing on the historical Jesus. And I was once at a presentation responding to him at SMU, at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, in which he came in and he said, I'm going to grant the conservative premise that some of the gospel tradition is related to eyewitness testimony, but here's the problem with eyewitnesses. And he went on to tell a story about this. So let me give you some quotes that kind of put this in context so you kind of know where we're going. Bart Ehrman. Even if the Gospels pose problems for historians, however, since they are written long after the facts they narrate by people who had not witnessed the events they described and who relied on inconsistent oral and written tradition about Jesus. Okay? So here's a dual claim. We aren't dealing with eyewitnesses in Bart Ehrman's view. That's more radical than Crossan. And even if we are, the material that we're resting it on is inconsistent oral and written tradition. Okay? There's no way to close the gap between what we have in the gospel and what really happened. That's what he's saying. This used to be described in historical Jesus studies as Lessing's ditch. Okay? And you have to watch how you say that. Lessing's ditch. And so the idea here is that there's a difference between the Christ of faith that we get in the Gospels and the real historical Jesus, and there's no way to get over that cavern. Basically, Ehrman is saying that in different words. Michael White, who's a professor of classics at the University of Texas at Austin, who's responsible for a PBS special that aired, about 15 years ago on PBS called From Jesus to Christ. The title tells you a lot. Okay? Said this: the problem for any historian of Jesus' life is that we don't have sources that come from the time of Jesus himself. Now that's an interesting quote for a whole variety of reasons. If he means we don't have any written sources, we don't possess today written sources that were written at the time that Jesus ministered on earth, that statement would be true. If he's claiming that we don't have sources that come from the time of Jesus himself, i.e., a time in which not only Jesus existed, but his contemporaries existed who lived and ministered with him, that statement might well be false. Okay? So we've got these two sets of claims kind of setting the temperature for where I want to go. Okay, so let me tell you about orality first, and then I'm going to talk about memory. A figure named Ken Bailey was a missionary in the Middle East working with Bedouins for years. I think he was there 20 years or more total. And he stepped into this orality discussion that is a part of the gospel discussion. And he claimed there are three that he experienced, and you can talk about three types of orality. His argument was, I live with Bedouins, they're illiterate, the way they pass on information is through oral channels primarily. I know how this works. Okay? And he said there really are three types of orality. What he called informal and uncontrolled. That's your telephone game. Okay? That's people simply telling the story with no oversight, no concern about its content from one person to another as you go down the line. Rudolf Bultmann's model of orality that he dealt with, he was a German New Testament scholar who dominated the 20th century, basically Bailey described as informal and uncontrolled. There's no formal oversight of it, there's no control going on about how it's passed on, and it can go anywhere and everywhere. Okay, that's one type. But he said that's not the only type of orality there was. When Bultmann released his model of orality, there actually was a pushback in New Testament studies before the time that Ken Bailey wrote, which argued for a formal and controlled type of orality like the rabbis exercised over their legal tradition. So the model was, and it fit Jewish background, Bultmann's model of orality came out of Icelandic folklore, among other places. So some New Testament scholars pushed back and said, no, there's a much more appropriate context, the context of Judaism and the rabbis. And if you watch how they did their orality before they wrote down things like the Mishnah and that kind of thing, it was formal and controlled. Okay? It was formal in that only certain people could pass on the story, and it was controlled and that there was oversight given to it. And it was very precise and very exact, and so the claim was that was like the rabbis. It was very precise, and only certain people could tell the story. Now the problem was, and this is why Bailey wrote his article, the problem was if we actually look at the Gospels where we're seeing these stories being transmitted, we don't get word for word exactitude in how those stories are being narrated. So it doesn't look to fit the claim of the formal and controlled model that people were putting forward that was rooted in the rabbis. Okay? So this led to Bailey's proposal based on his own experience with Bedouins. And he said what he saw was what he called informal and controlled. Anyone can tell the story, but there are people in control of the story who oversee it. And so he told the story about being gathered around the campfire, people telling stories, and if they told the story and they didn't wander too far in how they told it, then the person who had control of the story wouldn't say anything. But if they wandered too far, they'd be corrected. Okay, so that's how informal and controlled worked. And here is the point that he's making. Anyone could tell the story, but there was oversight of the core story at the same time. And what you got in the telling was a telling of a story that had variation within it, but the gist of the story was always the same. Okay? So you could get variation and gist. And Bailey's claim was what we see in the New Testament Gospels reminds him of what he experiences from the Bedouins, and he claimed the New Testament Gospels were of the third type, informal and controlled. Now, one of the things that you got to remember about this oral tradition as it's circulating through the churches in this gap period of somewhere between 30 and 60 years is that these stories are not just circulating in public, which is the way Ehrman likes to portray the way in which the tradition moved along. They're actually being told in the church services where elders and apostles are present, okay? Where people who are supposed to know the stories are there. So there is clearly some level of control. When Judas is replaced in Acts 1, with the figure who ends up being Mattathias, one of the qualifications is he had to be with Jesus from the beginning, which is a way of saying he had to really know Jesus. Why? Because of this oversight role. He really had to understand the ministry in order to occupy this position. So Bailey's argument is there's this third type of control. Okay, let me make an observation about this and how I think this works. And we've got a good illustration of it, not in a gospel, but in the book of Acts. In the book of Acts, I don't think this is in your notes. In the book of Acts, we have the story of Paul's conversion told 3 times. It's told in Acts 9, it's told in Acts 22, and it's told in Acts 26. Okay? Now the beauty of this example is Acts is written by the same author. Okay? So we've got the same author of Acts re-narrating the story or narrating the story of Saul's conversion through the appearance of Jesus 3 times in the book. And what do we see? We see what Bailey's talking about. We see variation and gist. If you read Acts 9, Acts 22, and Acts 26, you'll get different details in those stories. For example, the figure of Ananias appears in 2 of those 3 versions and is nowhere to be found in the 3rd version. Okay? That's an interesting difference. That's an interesting variation. But the core of the story in all 3 versions is the same. Jesus appeared to Saul, 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 why do you persecute me? It starts off that way. Saul receives a calling of ministry to the Gentiles. That's a key part. That's the gist. That's the same, etc. So my point is this. When we actually watch a story being retold within the biblical material, we see this variation in gist that is a reflection of informal and controlled orality. Okay? That's all I want to say about orality. There's a lot more that could be said, but that's all I'm going to say for now. Let's talk about memory. I have the name McIver up here. Robert McIver is an Australian who happened to be writing a book on Jesus and memory while I was on sabbatical in Tübingen, and he was in the apartment next door to us, okay, while he was doing this work. It's now out. This was back in 2010. I think the book came out in 2012. And to set this up, I need to tell you about the conversation I had with John Dominic Crossan at a presentation at SMU on memory. Crossan got up and he told this story. It's about an experiment, a very famous experiment, run at Emory University when the Challenger disaster happened. Now, y'all remember what the Challenger is? That was the space shuttle, okay, that exploded on launch, okay, about a couple of minutes in. And what made this explosion particularly tragic was this happened to be the mission that NASA decided a science teacher from a middle school would go into space with the astronauts and teach a science class from space about science and space. Okay? Only she didn't make it because the Challenger exploded on the way up. So Emory University ran an experiment on memory as a result of this tragic event. And what they did is they called in first-year students and asked them 2 questions. Where were you when you heard about the Challenger disaster, and how did you hear about it? Okay, those 2 questions. And they recorded the answers. 3 years later, on the very suspicious premise that they would be seniors, okay, 3 years later, they asked this freshman group back in. And they asked them these 2 questions. And they recorded their answers. Okay, the freshmen didn't know they were going to be called back for this, okay? And they recorded the questions. They compared the questions, their answers, and gave them the choice between the 2 sets of answers without identifying which answers came from where, okay, when they said it. And what they found was the students were inevitably drawn to the answers they gave more recently, and the answers oftentimes were different in detail from the answers they gave earlier. So John Dominic Crossan basically said, memory leaks. People don't remember stuff consistently. Okay? And so we can have eyewitness testimony, but that doesn't mean we necessarily get it right. Okay, that's the point that he's trying to make. So this is the Emory example. So I had the response. I'm hearing this for the first time when he's doing the presentation because this wasn't one of those deals where the person gave you the paper ahead of time. So I'm responding. I have the response off the cuff at the time. So I get up and I say, well, it's a very interesting experiment, but I wonder if the results would have been the same if that experiment had been performed with NASA astronauts. I said, because there's a difference between asking freshmen at Emory University who have no connection or stake in the space program at all, what their memory was, then you're just testing kind of random trauma. Okay? It's a whole nother thing if you ask someone who has something at stake in what it is that they're remembering, and I wonder if the results would be the same had it been done with NASA astronauts. I said, I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm deeply suspicious that that would impact the answer. There have since been experiments done in making a differentiation between people who have something at stake in what's being remembered and people who are just capturing a particularly vivid memory, and there is a difference. Anyway, so I raised that question. McIver's book goes through that example plus several other examples of experiments, and when he comes to the end of discussing memory, he says this. He says two things. One is that memory does shift across time in these studies. Details do change. But he also says this, two other things. After 5 years, that memory tends to solidify. In other words, when they run these experiments, they have people retell about their past. After about 5 years, the story becomes the story. And the second thing that he says is the gist is retained. Okay? No matter where you are in the sequence. Okay? People get the core part of the story, generally speaking, right. So they might discuss a detail about how many witnesses were present or what the color of the car was or what someone was wearing, something like that. But they'll be able to tell you there was an accident and someone died. That kind of thing. So, and then he goes on to make a couple of other points, and then there are points that I want to make as well, and they are this. That it's one thing to remember something randomly that you recall kind of on occasion as circumstances bring it to mind. It's another thing when you're dealing with the memory of something that is constantly being retold because it's regarded as significant. One of the things that's going on in the early church is the stories of Jesus were being told and retold because he was an important figure. And not only that, the memory that you're talking about is not just an individualized memory. The memory that you're talking about people having is a corporate memory. That's a different deal as well. You're not asking just what one person remembers about what took place. You're asking what several people remember about the same event, who work together on it, that kind of thing. And so here I think of a couple of circumstances about the way things go. And they go like this. When you're at someone has died, and you go to visit the family, what normally happens in that kind of an event, and this has a combination of orality and memory mixed together. People recall what it is about the person who's died that they remember and that they appreciate. That often happens at those kinds of events. And sometimes what you get is something like this. Someone tells a story about a particular event that involved the person, and they're remembering and reflecting, usually positively, about the person. And someone else says, I was at that event too, and this is what I remember. And they chip in. That kind of thing. That's oftentimes how memory works. And it's one thing to remember something at random, which is what that would be. It's a whole other thing to tell stories in a way in which you want them to be retained, which is what the early church was doing when you build this oral tradition. And as I've already said, corporate memory doesn't match individual memory. Now I want to put some of these things together as we talk about memory. And this is what I want to say about that. I didn't move the slides on from the quote, so let me do that. Here's how I learned about orality and how it works and how good it can be. And I learned this lesson from my children and from my grandchildren. Okay? Most of you, if you have kids, have probably read stories to your kids at night. And if you have grandchildren, you read stories to your grandkids when you're around them. Okay? This is a wonderful American tradition. And I used to read a story about Nicodemus to my oldest daughter when she was young. Now remember, my oldest, she was 2 or 3, 4 years old. Okay, so she can't read, she can't write. She lives in an oral world. That's the point. So I would read these stories to her, and we used to have these books put out by Concordia Publishing, Lutheran Publishing House, that were about biblical stories, and they were in rhyme. Okay? And her favorite one was about Nicodemus. Now, one of the things about being a dad, reading stories to your daughter is that this can get monotonous. It does happen. Okay? And so sometimes you go, I'm going to see if they're hanging in here with me. So I would do this sometimes, and what I would do is I would play with the rhyme, and I would change it. And you know what her reaction was when I would do that? She would go, Daddy, that's not how the story goes. And then she would quote to me the story. Or I think about my grandkids who literally can walk through a Star Wars movie and play all the parts. I mean, it's amazing what they can remember. Remember that when you're in an oral world and you're not used to the crutches of the written world that we get used to, that's how you've got to retain stuff. And it's actually amazing what the mind can do when it applies itself orally to something that it wants to recall. Another way I like to think about this is thinking about hymns and how you learn hymns. Okay? No one learns the words to Amazing Grace by saying, you know, I'm going to church tomorrow. We're going to sing Amazing Grace. I need to memorize the 4 verses. Okay? How do you learn the words to Amazing Grace? You sing it again and again and again and again, and you got it. You don't consciously work to remember it. And so when you hear, you don't just hear the notes. Okay? The words are running through your head. Okay? That's what repetition can do to memory. So there are a variety of factors that impact memory that are a part of this discussion that removes memory from simply being an abstract kind of conversation. So my point is to say that if you apply yourself to memory and you apply yourself to orality, there actually is a very effective way to communicate. And what Bailey was testifying to in the Bedouin culture was he saw this at work. And so he saw the stories being told with some variation, but the gist being the same. Now, I suspect that 2 years from now, if someone asks you, were you at that lecture that Dr. Bock gave in Warsaw, Indiana? Okay? And people say, well, about how many people were there? And you give a random 100, 120, 125. You know, that might change. But one of the things that I hope you'll remember and retain, kind of gist, is Dr. Bock did lecture and defend the idea that orality and memory can be trustworthy. Okay? I think the chances are good you're going to remember that part of the story. I like to tell this story in thinking about this. There's a colleague of mine who I edited a book with, a fellow named Robert Webb. We did a book together called Key Events in the Life of the Historical Jesus, edited. It actually was part of a group of about 15 scholars, each of whom wrote an essay on a given event in Jesus' life, plus some other essays, and we worked on it over a 10-year period. And he and I co-chaired this operation. And I was kind of the good cop, and he was kind of the bad cop. So the way this worked, it was a reflection of our personalities. And so the way this worked is I would tend to bring forward the evidence in the discussion that would look on things positively, and he was kind of he played the role of the skeptic in the room. Years later, after we had done this project, it was long out, in fact, about a year ago, we were both asked to respond as responders to a book by Craig Keener on miracles. Okay? Craig Keener wrote 2 volumes on miracles, and we were both asked to respond. We didn't talk to each other about how we were going to write the response. Guess what happened? I sat down and I wrote a piece explaining all the things that I thought supported Keener's thesis. I was the good cop. Robert Webb sat down and he wrote a piece raising all the skeptical questions about miracles things that he thought needed more probing and that kind of thing. He was the bad cop. We got up and gave our responses, and when it was all done in the response time afterwards, I said, we have just mirrored the experience that we had when we were serving in the IBR Jesus group. And I made one other point in thinking about all this in relationship to memory and miracles, and it was this, that you will walk away from this meeting, and there might be aspects of details you don't recall, but I guarantee there's one thing you're going to remember. That I spoke as the good cop on behalf of miracles, and Bob Webb raised questions about the thesis, etc., and played the bad cop. You'll remember that, okay? Or think about resurrection and empty tomb. You're going to remember, okay, whether the tomb was really empty or not. Those kinds of things. The gist you're going to recall. So the point that I'm making here is that memory may have variation in it, but the gist, the real core thing that happens, generally speaking, particularly if it's repeated and repeated close to the time of the event, that kind of thing, regarded as significant, remembered corporately, you put all these things on it, you add to the ability of memory and orality to work. That's the point that I'm trying to make. Now, there's another thing that comes in with memory that's also important, and that is how things get remembered. Do you simply remember things in light of the way they happened, or do you remember things in light of the way they worked out? In other words, when you remember things, you have some choices about what you bring into that memory. I can think about the way I felt at the time, or I can think about the way I felt in light of the way things worked out. Now, here's my point. Both of those levels of memory are historical. They are historical in different ways. And the reason I bring this up is because sometimes what skeptics will say about historical events tied to Jesus is they'll say, well, they're remembering that story in light of the resurrection and not in light of what happened at the time. That may be in some cases. In fact, there are places where the Gospels themselves indicate this. Two places in the Gospel of John leap to mind. One is when we're dealing with the cleansing of the temple, and the second is during the triumphal entry, in which remarks are made, and then it says, and we didn't realize this at the time, but after he was glorified, we reflected on these things. Okay? That's a kind of retrospective aspect to memory. Still historical, but historical in a different way. So you don't have to choose between either or thinking in terms of an event having a character at a certain time and how it's seen in light of the way things work out. This is not an either or choice. It oftentimes is a both and kind of choice and can still be historical. Why do I mention this? Well, let me give you an illustration of how I think this works. A contemporary one, a sports illustration. Okay? Back in the 1990s, during the time when Houston sports really struggled, Houston sports is kind of like the messianic life of Jesus. Okay? First there's suffering, and then someday there's coming exaltation. All right? All right? Those of you who are familiar with Cleveland, okay, will know that Cleveland operates in a similar world. Okay? All right? That's the reality of Cleveland sports. So Houston, the NBA team, was in the process of trying to claim their first NBA title. They had a semifinal series with Phoenix in which they had home court advantage. Now, you know how, in a best-of-7 series, you know how home court advantage works is you get to play one more game at home than you play on the road, and that's considered to be home court advantage because if you get to the 7th game, you get to play that 7th game at home, and it's seen as home court advantage. So Houston promptly had home court advantage against Phoenix, not only lost game 1 at home. The way these things worked is the first 2 games were played at home, then you traveled away, and then it went 1-1-1 until you at the end. So it actually went 2-2, 1-1-1 that way. Anyway, Houston lost the first 2 games of this series at home. So not only did they lose home court advantage after losing game 1, they really lost home court advantage after losing game 2. In the locker room after the game, the players were saying these two games were a wake-up call. Now, I guarantee you they didn't say it with enthusiasm. Okay? These games are a wake-up call. They were really saying, they better be a wake-up call. We better get our act together or we're out. They promptly went to Phoenix and won the next two games, winning back home advantage. Great deal. It was a wake-up call. They came home and promptly lost Game 5, losing home court advantage yet again. They went to Phoenix and won Game 6. Okay? And then they came home and they finally won Game 7. When they were interviewed after Game 7, they talked about how those first two games were wake-up call games. I guarantee you they told it with a completely different emotion after Game 7 than they had after Game 2. Okay? And everything that I'm talking about in the illustration shows the depth that history can give you in thinking about events depending on how the events are framed. Okay? So, the reason I'm making this point is to underscore the idea that because someone talks about an event of Jesus and they have the advantage of knowing where the story goes, doesn't mean they've necessarily distorted the history. It may be the frame through which they are looking at the history that's going on. Not only that, it adds an additional dimension, sometimes what we don't know the answer to, and that is, it also leaves the narrator a choice. I can choose to tell the story as it was experienced at the time without reference to the wider frame, or I can choose to tell the story with that in view. Here's an illustration of that. Does anyone know what the first war of the 20th century was originally called? What was it called? The Great War. Okay? What do we call it today? World War I. Why do we call it World War I? Because there was World War II. Okay? All right? We're talking about the same thing, but the framing of the event is different. Okay? And what I'm suggesting to you is history has depth. Okay? It has volume. It has space. Okay? And when you think of it that way, the possibilities of how you talk about that history open up. And when you've got multiple people talking about the history and the angle from which they talk about it, that opens up as well. So there are all kinds of things that can go on with history. I've already talked about grandkids and stories, so I won't revisit that. And I've already talked about family and friends' memory at death. I got another example. I once was sharing this lecture in New Zealand, and someone came up to me and said, here's another example of the same kind of thing. An army is at the same battle. A battalion commander tells the story one way, and a medic tells the story another, simply because of the role they had in the midst of the battle. Same event, same set of details, some cases probably seen from a different angle because of the different role that a person has in the event. You're capable of all that. And all that is done to underscore this. The difference in accounts doesn't necessarily mean contradiction because of all the factors that I've just talked about. Okay. Now, let's deal with minding this gap. So we've got this gap. It's between 30 to 60 years in most people's thinking. Okay, let's actually think about this one more time. And I want to think about it through Paul. Okay? And I'm talking about now the core theology of the church. I'm talking about the teaching on the resurrection and its theological significance and what it means and whether it happened or not. Okay? So I've got Paul writing before the time of the Gospels in 1 Corinthians 15, probably writing in the mid-50s, closed our gap down to about 25 years. Okay, that helps. Now, let's pause and think about that for a second. But Paul is writing about an experience, his conversion, as a result of belief in the resurrection, that dates much, much earlier. He's writing about it in 57, but the theology that he adopted in 35. 34, 36. Somewhere within a year or two, we think, because of Acts, somewhere within a year or two of the actual events in Jerusalem. But it's actually better than that. Because in order for Paul to process the event of Jesus' appearing to him that led to his conversion, he had to have previously heard the preaching in order to process what was happening. And he was a persecutor of the church, hearing the apostles' message and saying, I don't believe it. That's false. Don't buy it. That takes you back to before the time of his conversion and all the debates he had with the Christian leaders in the time when he was persecuting the church. And now I'm literally on top of the events themselves out of Jerusalem. So my point here is that this gap that we think we have with the core Christian story about Jesus being raised from the dead, literally in Paul's case, shrinks back on top of the event itself. And there is no gap. There's no gap to mind. And this is why the conversion from Saul to Paul matters, because what it shows is, and Paul knew the debates. He knew about the empty tomb and the claims of the empty tomb. He knew all that was, Paul doesn't come forward and say, oh, it's a myth. They made it up, and now I believe in the myth. No, he was there, engaged in the very debate. He knew there was an empty tomb. He knew that Bart Ehrman's solution that Jesus actually died and rotted on the cross right there and was never taken to an empty tomb is, if there's a myth, that's the myth. He knew that. And we're literally on top of the gap itself. So if we mind the content, the core content of the gist of the Christian message in what it is that the Gospels are saying about Jesus and what it is that the resurrection represents, we've actually got no gap. Not bad. Not bad. Here's what I'm saying. With this, I'm wrapping up. Orality is a different kind of remembering, and when one is used to it, it is done better. I am saying it's not the telephone game, and that the core of this memory is surely likely to have been gotten right. If we mind the gap and where it comes from, and if we think through the history and importance of Saul, it's not as great time-wise as it's made out to be. And the importance of Paul is that he knew the debate, he knew the events, he knew the tradition, he was in Jerusalem at the time. He shuts down the gap. So an overall summary, this is not the telephone game, but it's a set of events surely able to be remembered and surely able to be passed on. And that's how you mind the gap.
Thank you for joining with us concerning Darrell's third and final session of our Let's Know the Bible conference held in Northern Indiana in 2015. I hope that it has been informative as we have done an examination of Jesus in the Gospels, particularly how to read the Gospels, how to interpret the Gospels, and how to understand the Gospels. In this booklet that we provided at the conference, the Let's Know the Bible conference, there was a section entitled 33 Days in the Gospel of Mark, written by Jeremy Wyke and Aaron Peer. As we publish this set of notes to accompany this set of videos, this too will be available to you. 33 Days in the Gospel of Mark. It's a devotional guide for the entire family. I trust that you will pick this devotional guide up, or this entire conference booklet, and after the conference, after listening to these conference videos, you'll take advantage of this devotional guide established by two pastors here in Northern Indiana, concerned with and desiring for people to read the Bible, to read the Gospel of Mark with some sort of intelligence and understanding. In the meantime, I trust you will have a great day. Until our next year's conference, walk with the King and be a blessing. Thank you.